The brass mortar felt heavier in Sarah Harper's hands as dawn broke through the boarding house windows. Each grinding motion released Camphor's sharp bite into the cramped room where her father lay dying. 37 cents remained in Mother's tea tin, enough for 3 more days of laudanum. Perhaps 4 if she halved his doses. The knock came precisely at 7. Sheriff Holbrook stood beside Banker Morton, both men avoiding her eyes. Morton's manicured fingers trembled as he unfolded the foreclosure notice. "Miss Harper, your father owes $800. Payment is due today. We have nothing left to sell." Morton's thin lips curved. "There is an alternative. Legal precedent from Kansas Territory. A public auction for marriage contract. Your bride price would settle all debts." Sarah's spine straightened despite her trembling hands. Outside, neighbors gathered like crows. "1 week," she whispered. "Grant me 1 week to prepare." Morton smiled, already tasting victory. "Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story." Clay Morgan's boots found familiar grooves in the dusty road leading into Copper Creek, though 5 years had carved new lines across his weathered face. The Montana sun beat down on his patched duster, and his scarred hands gripped leather reins worn smooth from countless miles. He'd changed since leaving rail work had hardened his body while grief had tempered his soul. The town looked smaller somehow. Buildings weather-beaten and leaning like tired old men. Clay headed straight for Samuel's Mercantile, needing supplies and dreading the memories each storefront would surely resurrect. The bell above the door chimed unchanged. Old Samuel looked up from his ledger, squinting through wire spectacles before recognition dawned. "Clay Morgan, Lord Almighty. Thought you were dead, son." "Not yet," Clay replied, voice rough from disuse. He moved between pickle barrels and fabric bolts, selecting coffee, flour, and ammunition with practiced efficiency. Samuel's weathered hands paused over the Montgomery Ward catalog. "Shameful business happening tomorrow. You remember Judge Harper poor man's dying, and that vulture Morton's forcing his daughter into one of those marriage auctions to settle debts." The tin of Arbuckle's coffee slipped in Clay's grip. Sarah Harper, the very same sweet girl who taught school, tended folks during the fever. Now Morton's got her up for auction like livestock. Already got 3 men planning to bid, including that snake Thornton, looking for wife number 3. Clay's chest tightened. Sarah Harper, the woman who'd held his daughter's hand through burning fever, who'd sung hymns when the medicine ran out. She'd closed little Emma's eyes with such tenderness when the end came, then held his wife Mary through her final hours. He'd been away, helping neighbors battle the same fever, returning too late to say goodbye. What time? The words came out sharper than intended. Noon tomorrow, town square. Clay paid for his goods and walked to the cemetery as evening painted the sky purple. The wooden crosses had weathered gray, but the names remained clear. Mary Morgan, Emma Morgan. He knelt in the dried grass, pulling wildflowers from his saddlebag. "I've been working, Mary, saving every penny from the railroad. Got $340 now." His fingers traced Emma's name. "Remember Miss Sarah, how she stayed with you both when I couldn't? She needs help now." The wind carried the scent of sage as Clay touched the locket holding a strand of Emma's golden hair. Some debts couldn't be calculated in dollars, but honor demanded payment just the same. Sarah Harper pressed the cool glass of laudanum to her father's cracked lips, measuring each precious drop. The morning sun filtered through threadbare curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny witnesses to her deception. "Just going to teach, Papa," she whispered, smoothing his gray hair. "Rest now." Judge Harper's eyes flickered open, still sharp despite the illness consuming him. For a moment, Sarah feared he knew, but fever pulled him back under, and she released a shuddering breath. In her small room, she lifted Mother's navy wool dress from tissue paper, the fabric still holding hints of rosewater. Her fingers trembled over pearl buttons worn smooth by another woman's hands. Sarah had sold everything else the silver brush set. Father's law books, even mother's wedding china. This dress alone remained, preserved for a wedding that would never come. Not the wedding she'd imagined. Anyway, the town square already buzzed with activity when Sarah arrived. Men hammered together a wooden platform while women clustered in groups, some weeping openly, others whispering behind gloved hands. Veterans from the war had lowered the American flag to half-mast, a silent protest that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Morton supervised the platform construction with obvious satisfaction, his gold watch chain catching sunlight as he directed workers. A brass spittoon sat beside the auctioneer's podium, and someone had dragged benches from the church, arranging them like theater seating. The brass band instruments remained covered, their players refusing Morton's offer to provide entertainment. Miss Harper. Mrs. Chen approached, pressing a small silk handkerchief into Sarah's palm. From the sewing circle, we tried to gather money, but... I know. Sarah squeezed the older woman's weathered hands. Thank you. More townspeople arrived as noon approached. Sarah recognized Rancher Thornton's carriage, the man himself already eyeing her like horseflesh at market. His two previous wives lay in early graves, worn out by childbearing and frontier hardship. Other potential bidders gathered: the mine owner Hutchins, the elderly widower Patterson, men with money and peculiar appetites for young wives. Through the crowd, Sarah glimpsed a familiar figure in a worn duster. Clay Morgan stood at the edge of the square, his face shadowed by his hat brim. She remembered him from before the gentleman destroyed by fever's cruelty, who'd disappeared into grief 5 years past. Why had he returned now? To witness her humiliation, Morton struck the podium with his gavel. "Gentlemen, shall we begin?" Sarah lifted her chin, walking toward the platform with measured steps. The crowd parted like a biblical sea, their faces mixing pity with morbid fascination. Some called out protests. But Morton had the law on his side: Kansas precedent, territorial statutes, documents that reduced her to chattel. She climbed the rough wooden steps, each creak echoing across the square. The morning sun struck her auburn hair, setting it ablaze with copper fire. Women wept, men looked away, but Sarah stood straight, hands clasped, refusing to grant Morton the satisfaction of her tears. "Sarah Frances Harper," Morton announced, voice carrying like a carnival barker's. 26 years of age, educated, healthy, skilled in household management. Opening bid set at $50. Thornton's voice cut through the crowd's murmur. 100. 150, called Hutchins. Sarah focused on the mountains beyond town, imagining herself dissolving into that blue distance. Below, she sensed movement: Clay Morgan pushing through the crowd, his face set with strange determination. 200, Thornton declared, already confident of victory. The crowd grew quiet, anticipating conclusion. Morton raised his gavel, smile widening. Then a clear voice rang out. $340. Every head turned toward Clay Morgan, standing now at the platform's base, worn bills clutched in his scarred hands. Morton's gavel hung suspended. "You cannot be serious." $340, Clay repeated, louder. "And respect for the lady's choice." Laughter rippled through some of the crowd, a raggedy cowboy playing hero with his life's savings. But others saw deeper, remembering Clay's losses, Sarah's kindness during the fever time. Thornton sneered. $350. Clay's jaw tightened. That was everything: 5 years of breaking his back on railroad crews, sleeping in dirt, saving every penny. He looked up at Sarah, and she saw something in his eyes beyond pity or charity. Recognition, shared grief, a debt of honor. $340, he said quietly, and a promise she'll never stand on an auction block again. The crowd fell silent. Even Thornton hesitated, calculating whether spite was worth another $10. Morton's gavel struck wood like a gunshot. Sold. Sarah's knees nearly buckled, but she held steady, watching Clay Morgan count out his worn bills with careful precision. He'd saved her with everything he had, this broken man who understood loss. Their eyes met across the chaos of dispersing crowd and settling debts. His lips formed silent words. "This ain't what it seems. Miss Sarah." But what else could it be? She was bought and paid for, saved from Thornton's cruel hands, but bound just the same. The sun climbed higher, casting short shadows as Sarah Harper descended the platform toward her purchased future, wondering what price Clay Morgan would extract for his kindness. The wondering, she would learn, would be harder than the knowing. The bidding war erupted like wildfire across the town square. Thornton's face flushed red as he barked, 400! His thick fingers gripped his walking stick, knuckles white with fury at being challenged by a nobody. "That's more than you have. Morgan," someone called from the crowd. "Everyone knows you've got nothing but the clothes on your back." Clay stood firm, his worn boots planted solid on the dusty ground. $340 is my bid, cash in hand. He held the bills high, letting everyone see. More than enough to clear the Harper debts. Morton's eyes glittered with malicious pleasure. "Mr. Thornton has bid 400. Going once." "He doesn't have 400 on him," Clay interrupted. "This is a cash auction, isn't it? Or are you taking promises now?" "Morton." The banker's smile faltered. The terms were clear: immediate payment required. Thornton fumbled for his wallet, counting bills with increasing desperation. 370. 380. He looked up, rage twisting his features. "I'll have the rest within the hour." "Auction rules state immediate payment," Judge Holbrook said quietly, surprising everyone. The sheriff had remained silent until now, but his sense of justice finally overwhelmed his fear of Morton. Cash on the barrel, as they say. Clay walked forward, each step deliberate, and placed his entire savings on Morton's podium. The worn bills fluttered in the breeze. 5 years of 18-hour days, of sleeping in snow and scorching sun, of denying himself everything beyond bare survival. $340, he said again. "And respect for the lady's choice." That phrase rang through the square like a church bell. Women dabbed their eyes while men shifted uncomfortably. Even those who'd come for entertainment felt the weight of Clay's words. Thornton spat tobacco juice near Clay's boots. "You think you're some kind of hero. Morgan buying yourself a pretty wife with railroad money. She's educated, refined. What's she going to do with a broken-down cowboy who can't even keep his own family alive?" The cruelty of the words sucked air from the square. Everyone remembered the fever time, how Clay had been helping the Martinez family when his own wife and daughter took sick. Sarah's sharp intake of breath cut through the silence. Clay's hands clenched, but his voice remained steady. "What she does is her choice. That's the difference between you and me. Thornton," Morton struck his gavel with excessive force, "sold to Clayton Morgan for $340. He seemed to relish each word. "Payment received. Proceed immediately to the courthouse for marriage documentation." The crowd parted as Clay approached the platform. He didn't extend his hand to help Sarah down. Instead, he removed his hat and waited at the bottom of the steps, allowing her to descend with dignity and tact. She recognized the gesture, the careful preservation of what little autonomy remained to her. "Miss Harper," he said softly, "I'm sorry it came to this." Sarah studied his weathered face, seeing new lines carved by grief and labor. She remembered him from before, gentle with his daughter, devoted to his wife, the kind of man who sang lullabies and carved wooden toys. Now he stood before her, having spent everything to purchase her like property. Why? The word escaped before she could stop it. Clay's brown eyes met hers directly. "You know why?" And she did. Emma Morgan's fevered hand in hers, Mary Morgan's grateful eyes as Sarah sang hymns through the long dying. The debt he felt he owed, paid now with his life savings. They walked to the courthouse in strange procession, Morton eager to complete his paperwork, the crowd following at a distance, whispers rising like wind through wheat. Sarah noticed how Clay walked slightly apart from her, maintaining respectful distance, never presuming ownership despite the transaction just completed. Inside the courthouse, Judge Holbrook prepared the marriage certificate with obvious reluctance. His hands shook as he dipped the steel pen in ink. "This isn't right," he muttered. "If I had any authority left, you don't." Morton cut in. "Proceed, Judge." The ceremony was a mockery of sacred vows. Sarah stood in her mother's dress while Clay remained in his trail-worn clothes, dust still clinging to his boots. The witnesses, Morton gloating, Mrs. Chen weeping, watched as they spoke the required words. "Do you, Clayton Morgan, take this woman as your lawful wife?" "I do." Clay's voice carried surprising gentleness. "Do you, Sarah Harper, accept this marriage contract as payment of your family's debts?" The phrasing made her stomach turn. Not take this man, but accept this contract. She was merchandise, transferred from seller to buyer. "I do." Judge Holbrook's eyes filled with tears as he whispered, "I'm so sorry, my dear. Your father would—" He stopped, unable to continue. "By the authority vested in me by Montana Territory, I pronounce this marriage legal and binding." He could barely speak the final words. "You may, that is, the contract is complete." This no mention of kissing the bride? No blessing? Just transaction concluded, debt settled, ownership transferred. As they signed the register, Clay leaned close enough for only Sarah to hear. "This ain't what it seems, Miss Sarah. I promise you that. Just need you to trust me a little while." Sarah's hand trembled as she signed her new name, Sarah Morgan. The ink looked like blood on the pale paper. Through the courthouse window, she could see the auction platform being dismantled. Boards that had held her on display now returning to ordinary lumber. "Your father's debts are cleared," Morton announced with satisfaction. "The boarding house remains his until his passing, after which it reverts to the bank. Good day, Mrs. Morgan." The title felt like shackles. Sarah had entered the courthouse as herself and emerged as someone's property, purchased with railroad money and bound by territorial law. Yet Clay Morgan walked beside her, not ahead or behind, and his first words as her legal husband were, "We need to get medicine for your father. I know you gave him the last of the laudanum this morning." She stopped walking, staring at him in surprise. Clay's weathered face showed understanding. "Saw you counting doses yesterday through the window. Not spying, just wanted to know how bad things were. Come on. Samuel keeps medical supplies. Your father needs tending." This strange man who'd bought her hadn't immediately claimed his rights or taken her to his home. Instead, his first thought was for her dying father. Sarah followed him through the dusty streets, wondering what kind of man spent everything he had to purchase a wife, then concerned himself with her father's medicine. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they walked, neither touching, both bound by law yet separated by the vast gulf of circumstance. Behind them, the crowd dispersed with gossip that would feed the town for months. But Clay Morgan seemed oblivious to whispers, focused only on getting laudanum for a dying man who would never know his daughter had been sold to settle his debts. "Thank you," Sarah finally said. Clay glanced at her, and she saw depths of sadness in his eyes that matched her own. "Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Morgan. You don't know what you've agreed to." But he was wrong. She hadn't agreed to anything. She'd been sold, purchased, transferred like property. The agreement was between men, about her, without her. Clay Morgan might be kinder than Thornton, might preserve some illusion of dignity, but she was still bought and paid for. The wooden sidewalk creaked under their feet as they approached the mercantile, and Sarah wondered if she'd ever walk freely again, or if every step would forever echo with the sound of Morton's gavel, marking her as merchandise sold to the highest bidder. Clay Morgan stood outside the abandoned chapel at the edge of town, his hands working to clear away 3 years of tumbleweeds from the entrance. The morning sun slanted through broken windows, casting fragments of colored light across weathered pews. Sarah watched from the doorway, confused by this strange detour from what she'd expected being taken to his home, wherever that might be. "The courthouse wedding wasn't proper," Clay said without turning around. His voice carried quiet determination. "You deserve better than Morton Circus." Mr. Morgan. Clay. He finally faced her, dust motes dancing between them in the morning light. I know you had no choice in this, but maybe we can have choice in how we go forward. Sarah's throat tightened. We're already married. The law made a transaction. That's not a wedding. He pulled a worn handkerchief from his pocket, wiping sweat from his brow. Found Father Miguel at the mission. He's willing to do a proper ceremony. Mrs. Chen agreed to witness, along with Samuel from the mercantile. But only if you're willing. The unexpected kindness threatened her composure. Why does it matter? Clay was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the broken stained glass windows. My Mary and I were married here, 20 years ago next month. Maybe it's foolish, but I believe words spoken in a sacred place carry weight. The courthouse was about debt and paper. This could be about something else. About what? About choosing how we treat each other, even when choice has been taken from us. Sarah studied his weathered face, searching for deception or hidden motives. She found only a profound weariness and something else, a desperate need to make something decent from indecent circumstances. I have nothing to wear but this, she said, gesturing to her mother's navy dress, now dusty from the morning's ordeal. Clay reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. It's not much. Found them growing wild near the creek. Sarah unwrapped the bundle to find Wildflower's Indian paintbrush, prairie roses, and lupines, their stems wrapped in wet cloth to keep them fresh. They were tied with a piece of faded blue ribbon that looked like it had been saved from something else, something precious. That ribbon was Emma's, Clay said quietly. From her birthday dress. She'd want it used for something good. Father Miguel arrived within the hour, his brown cassock dusty from the ride. The old priest's eyes held deep sadness as he embraced Sarah. Child, I baptized you in this very chapel. Your parents stood where you stand now. He glanced at Clay with something like approval. Sometimes God works through imperfect circumstances. Mrs. Chen bustled in carrying a basket, followed by Samuel, who'd closed his store for the occasion. Brought honey bread, Mrs. Chen announced, as if feeding people could solve any sorrow. And proper wine for communion, not that rot gut from the saloon. They arranged themselves before the altar, sunlight streaming through broken windows to paint them in blues and golds. The chapel smelled of sage and old wood, with hints of incense lingering from services long past. Clay had found 2 tin rings at the mercantile, simple bands he'd apparently purchased years ago for some forgotten purpose. These aren't much, he said, offering one to Sarah. They're honest, she replied, surprising herself with the response. Father Miguel opened his worn prayer book, pages yellowed with age. We gather not to create a union, for that has already been done by law. We gather to bless what exists and to seek grace for the path ahead. The words were different from the courthouse, no mention of contracts or debts, only of kindness, patience, and hope. When Father Miguel asked for vows, Clay spoke first. I promise to respect your choices, to never use the law's power against you, and to work toward your freedom rather than your bondage. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the wildflower bouquet. These weren't traditional vows, but nothing about this was traditional. When her turn came, she found words she didn't expect. I promise to see you as you are, not as circumstances have forced you to be honest in my dealings with you, and to honor the sacrifice you've made. Father Miguel blessed the rings with holy water that had somehow survived in the chapel's font. As Clay slipped the tin band onto Sarah's finger, his calloused hands were gentle, careful not to presume intimacy. When she placed the matching ring on his finger, she noticed scars across his palms, marks from 5 years of brutal labor that had paid for her freedom from Thornton. What God has joined, let no man put asunder, Father Miguel intoned, though everyone present knew man had already done plenty of sundering. You may kiss, that is. You may seal this blessing as you see fit. Clay simply took Sarah's hand, bowing slightly over it like a gentleman from another era. Thank you for this, he said softly. The small wedding party returned to the boarding house as afternoon shadows grew long. Sarah expected Clay to claim the room adjacent to hers, to begin asserting husbandly rights. Instead, he went straight to her father's bedside, checking the judge's breathing and fever with practiced movements. "He needs whale oil treatments for his lungs," Clay said. "I've seen it work on minors with similar conditions. May I?" Sarah nodded, watching as this strange man who'd purchased her that morning now tended her father with unexpected gentleness. He prepared the treatment with steady hands, explaining each step to her, never presuming authority in her father's care. Supper was simple Mrs. Chen's honey bread, canned peaches Clay had bought, coffee that Samuel contributed. They ate in the boarding house's small dining room, the same table where Sarah had taken meals alone for months. Clay spoke little, but when her father stirred, he was immediately alert, helping her administer laudanum with careful precision. As darkness fell, Sarah prepared to show Clay to the room she'd assumed he'd take. Instead, he gathered a blanket from his saddlebag. "Stable's got clean hay," he said. "I'll be comfortable enough. You're my husband by law. The room is yours." Clay interrupted gently. "This arrangement, I know what it is and what it isn't. You were forced into this. I won't add to that forcing." Sarah stood in the doorway, lamplight casting shadows across the worn floorboards. "Why did you really buy me, Clay? The truth." He paused at the back door, his silhouette dark against the evening sky. "Your kindness to my family when the fever took them. You held Emma's hand for hours, sang to her when she was scared. You closed Mary's eyes with such gentleness. I couldn't save them, but maybe I could save you from Thornton. It's not enough to balance the debt, but it's all I had. So I'm your penance." Clay turned to face her fully, and she saw pain flicker across his features. "No, ma'am. You're the woman who showed my daughter mercy in her last hours. You're the teacher who gave everything for your father. You're someone who deserved better than that auction block. If sleeping in the stable and keeping distance helps preserve your dignity, then that's what I'll do." He left before she could respond, his footsteps fading toward the stable. Sarah stood alone in the boarding house that still smelled of whale oil and medicine, wearing a tin ring and holding wildflowers tied with a dead child's ribbon. Through the window, she could see lamplight in the stable where her husband, strange to even think the word, was settling into hay like a farmhand. She looked down at the simple ring on her finger, then at her father sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. Clay Morgan had spent everything to buy her, then asked for nothing in return except the chance to make their forced union slightly more bearable. He'd given her wildflowers instead of chains, distance instead of demands. Moving to her father's bedside, Sarah adjusted his blankets and checked his breathing. The whale oil treatment seemed to be helping. His chest rose and fell more easily. On the nightstand sat the bottle of laudanum Clay had purchased. Enough for 2 weeks at proper doses. Outside, a harmonica played softly from the stable, a lonely melody that spoke of loss and long roads. Sarah recognized the tune Shenandoah, a song about rivers and separation. She wondered what memories Clay carried, what ghosts haunted his nights in addition to Mary and Emma. Tomorrow, the town would gossip about the raggedest wedding in Copper Creek history. They'd speculate about the wedding night, about what rights Clay would claim. They'd never know he was sleeping in hay, playing harmonica to the horses, maintaining careful distance from the woman he'd bought but wouldn't own. Sarah touched the tin ring again. It was simple, honest, and surprisingly comfortable, nothing like the heavy gold bands Thornton's wives had worn like shackles. Through the window, stars emerged in the clear Montana sky, and the harmonica continued its mournful tune. She'd been sold that morning, married twice by afternoon, and now sat in lamplight wearing wildflowers while her husband slept with horses. Nothing about this day had been what she'd expected when she'd risen at dawn to prepare her father's medicine. The harmonica finally fell silent, and Sarah heard only the wind through cottonwoods and her father's improved breathing. Somewhere in the stable, Clay Morgan was likely staring at the same stars, carrying his own burden of forced choices and salvaged honor. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, Morton's continued scheming, the town's judgment, the strange navigation of a marriage neither had chosen. But tonight, in the quiet boarding house with whale oil treatments and wildflower bouquets, Sarah found an unexpected peace. Clay had promised to work toward her freedom rather than her bondage. It was more than she'd dared hope for when the gavel fell. Sarah found the notebook by accident. Clay had left before dawn for day labor at the Riverside Ranch, taking only coffee and cornbread, leaving his saddlebag hanging on the peg by the door. When she moved it to sweep, the worn leather journal fell onto the floorboards, pages splaying open to reveal careful columns of numbers and dates. Her first instinct was to close it, to respect his privacy as he'd respected hers these past 3 days. But her eyes caught familiar words: Harper Ranch, Section 12, Township 4. Her family's old land, the place Morton had seized 2 years ago when her father first fell ill. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, morning light streaming across pages filled with Clay's careful handwriting. Each entry dated, each penny accounted for. The first entry was dated just weeks after his family's death. Railroad work, Nebraska line, $1.50 per day, saved $1. Page after page showed the same meticulous recording. Money earned, money saved, money spent only on bare necessities. But it was the second column that made her hands tremble: land purchases, all around her family's former ranch. Bought Nielsen's Creek access, $47. Purchased water rights from Hendricks, $73. Acquired Northern pasture from bank auction, $95. Between the entries were notes. Sarah Harper taught school despite father's shame. She visits Mary and Emma's graves, leaves flowers. Morton raising interest rates again. Thornton sniffing around boarding house. The pattern became clear. Clay hadn't just been saving money. He'd been strategically buying every piece of property surrounding her family's ranch. The dates showed he'd started immediately after burying his wife and daughter, as if their death had triggered some mission she couldn't yet understand. Sarah dressed quickly and walked to the land office, the journal hidden in her basket beneath fresh bread for her father. The clerk, Thomas Winters, was young and eager to talk, especially to the mysterious Mrs. Morgan everyone was gossiping about. "I need to check some property records," she said, keeping her voice casual. "For household planning purposes." Thomas brightened at having something to do. "Of course, Mrs. Morgan. Which parcels?" Sarah listed the sections from Clay's journal, watching as Thomas pulled large leather-bound ledgers from shelves. The records confirmed what the journal suggested. Clay Morgan had been quietly purchasing land for 5 years, always paying cash, always buying parcels that bordered the original Harper Ranch. "Your husband's been clever," Thomas said admiringly. "Morton's been trying to assemble these parcels for his cattle operation, but Mr. Morgan always outbid him by just enough." Made Morton furious, especially since he couldn't figure out who was buying through the Denver lawyers. Denver lawyers. Mr. Morgan never bought directly, always used Hayes and Associates as intermediaries. Smart man Morton would have blocked the sales if he'd known. Thomas leaned closer, conspiratorial. Morton even hired Pinkertons to investigate, but they couldn't trace the buyer. Your husband paid the lawyers in cash, no banks involved. Sarah's mind raced. Clay had spent 5 years not just saving but strategically undermining Morton's expansion plans. Every parcel he'd bought cut Morton's access to water or roads, making the seized Harper Ranch less valuable without the surrounding land. "Mrs. Morgan?" She turned to find Morton himself standing in the doorway, his pale eyes narrowing as he saw the open ledgers. "Researching your new husband's holdings." His thin smile held malice. "You should know he's overextended himself. All that land, no cattle, no capital to develop it, and now he's spent his last penny on, well, on you." Sarah closed the ledger carefully. "My husband's business is his own. His business is now yours, dear woman. And when he defaults on property taxes, which he surely will, I'll be waiting." Morton stepped closer, cologne failing to mask the scent of stale tobacco. "He may have bought you, but he can't maintain you. Come winter, You'll both be begging. Is that a threat? It's economics. Your husband is land rich and cash poor. He has no credit, no connections, and now no savings. Morton's smile widened. I offered him a loan yesterday, generous terms. He refused. Pride goes before a fall. Mrs. Morgan. Sarah left the land office with her mind churning. Back at the boarding house, she found her father awake and lucid, a rare blessing. She fed him broth while studying Clay's journal more carefully. The final entries showed the accumulation. Total saved $340. Total land acquired 847 acres. Debt remaining $0. He'd bought nearly 2,000 acres, piece by piece, with railroad money. But Morton was right without cattle or capital. The land was just expensive grass. Property taxes alone would ruin them. That evening, Clay returned covered in dust and sweat from repairing fences. He washed at the pump outside before entering, always careful not to bring dirt into her clean house. Sarah had supper waiting: beans and salt pork. Nothing fancy, but hot and filling. Good day, she asked, serving his plate. 12 miles of fence line checked. Riverside's having rustler problems. He ate with quiet efficiency, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. Sarah waited until he'd finished eating. Then she placed his journal on the table between them. Clay's expression didn't change, but his hands stilled. You've been buying back our land, she said. It wasn't a question. It was never about buying it back. Clay's voice was soft. It was about keeping Morton from having it all. Why? Clay was quiet for a long moment, staring at his calloused hands. Your father was the only one who stood up for me after Mary and Emma died. When folks whispered I'd abandoned them to help strangers, he reminded them I was helping their families too. He said a man can't be two places at once, can't save everyone. His voice roughened. He kept me from eating my gun that first winter. Sarah's breath caught. She'd never known this, never knew her father had intervened. So you spent 5 years buying land we can't afford to keep. Not we, Clay corrected. You. The deeds are being transferred to your name alone. Hayes and Associates has the paperwork ready. The marriage doesn't give me claim to property purchased before. It's all yours, free and clear. The implications staggered her. Clay, the taxes alone. I know. He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the stable. But Morton can't force you to sell if you own it outright. And there are ways to make land profitable without cattle. Hay contracts with the Army, leasing to smaller ranchers, mineral rights if we're lucky. He turned to face her. Poor choice of words. Your land, your decisions. I'm just hired help who happens to sleep in your stable. Sarah stood as well, anger rising. You spent everything you had on some obligation to my father, on land I can't maintain. What kind of plan is that? The only one I could live with. Clay replied. Your family lost everything because your father stood by me. Morton vultures around tragedy, picking bones clean. I couldn't let him have your heritage too. So instead, I'll lose it to taxes while you play the martyr in my stable. For the first time since the auction, Clay's control cracked. What would you have had me do? Let Thornton buy you, watch Morton feast on your father's legacy while you suffered. I did what I could with what I had. You had $340. You could have started fresh somewhere, built your own life. I didn't want my own life. The words exploded from him. I wanted to fix something, to make one thing right in all this wrongness. Your father saved my life with his words. You saved my soul by how you treated my girls. This was all I could give back. Silence stretched between them. Outside, evening birds called to each other across the growing darkness. Show me the tax assessments, Sarah finally said. Clay retrieved another notebook, this one filled with calculations. The numbers were stark. They had perhaps 2 months before the tax bills came due. Without cash income, they'd lose everything by Christmas. Morton knows, Sarah said. He offered you a loan. Morton's loans are traps. He'd own us within a year. Then what do we do? Clay looked at her, surprise flickering across his features at the word we. There's a cattle drive coming through next month, he said slowly. Henderson's outfit, heading to Wyoming. They'll need hay and camping rights. If we charge fairly, might cover half the taxes. The Army contract bidding opens next week. If we undercut Morton just enough. They worked through the evening, planning and calculating. Sarah's education proved invaluable. She could figure percentages and compound interest faster than Clay could write them down. They mapped the land parcels, identified water sources, calculated hay yields. Her father woke briefly, and Clay tended him while Sarah continued working. She watched them together, her husband's gentle hands adjusting pillows, his voice soft as he explained the treatments. Whatever else Clay Morgan was impulsive, prideful, stubborn, he was unfailingly kind to her dying father. Near midnight, they'd outlined a possible plan, risky, requiring perfect timing and no bad weather, but possible. Clay gathered the papers, preparing to return to the stable. You could sleep inside, Sarah said quietly. The parlor has a cot. Clay studied her face in the lamplight. That wouldn't be proper. Folks already talk enough. Let them talk. You're exhausted, and we have work tomorrow. Partners need rest. Partners. Sarah held up the pages of calculations. You saved my land without my knowledge. The least I can do is help you keep it. Besides, she added, surprising herself with a small smile, I'm better at mathematics than you are. Clay's weathered face softened. That you are, Mrs. Morgan. That you are. He retrieved his bedroll from the stable, setting up the cot in the parlor with careful movements. Sarah provided clean sheets and a proper pillow, small civilizing touches that seemed to perplex him. As she prepared for bed, Sarah could hear him settling into sleep, the first night he'd spent under a roof in days. Through her window, she saw the moon rising over the land he'd bought for her nearly 2,000 acres of possibility and burden, purchased with railroad sweat and frontier determination. Morton thought them fools, and perhaps they were. But as Sarah touched the tin ring on her finger, she realized something had shifted. They were no longer buyer and bought, owner and owned. They were two people trying to salvage something from loss, to build meaning from circumstance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time since the auction, Sarah Harper Morgan felt something besides despair. It might have been hope, or it might have been simply the relief of sharing an impossible burden. Either way, it was enough. The storm struck just after midnight, thunder cracking like rifle shots across the Montana sky. Sarah woke to the sound of her father gasping, his breathing reduced to desperate wheezes that barely moved his chest. She lit the coal oil lamp with trembling fingers, the yellow light revealing his blue-tinged lips and the terror in his eyes. Clay. She didn't hesitate to call for him. Propriety forgotten in the face of crisis. He appeared in the doorway within seconds, barefoot and shirt hastily pulled on. One look at Judge Harper and he was moving, checking pulse points and lifting the older man higher on his pillows. His lungs are filling, Clay said tersely. The storm pressure's making it worse. We need Dr. Mitchell. He's 15 miles out at the Hendricks place. Their boy has scarlet fever. Clay was already pulling on his boots. Then I'll bring him back. In this storm, the creek will be flooding. You'll never make it. Lightning illuminated his face, set with determination. Your father won't last until morning without help. Sarah grabbed his arm. Clay? No. It's suicide to ride in this. He covered her hand with his, the first time he'd deliberately touched her since their wedding. I've ridden through worse. Keep him upright. Give him small sips of whiskey mixed with honey if he can swallow. If his lips go darker blue, pound on his back between the shoulder blades hard. It might clear some fluid. Then he was gone, the door slamming against the wind. Sarah heard his horse's hooves splashing through mud, fading into the storm's chaos. She turned back to her father, whose eyes were wide with fear not for himself, but for the man who'd just ridden into hell for him. The next hours blurred together. Sarah held her father upright, spooning tiny amounts of the whiskey mixture between his lips. When his breathing grew too shallow, she did as Clay instructed, pounding on his back until he coughed up thick fluid. Her arms ached, her back screamed, but she continued the rhythm lift. Sip, pound, breathe. Around 3 a.m, her father's fever spiked. In his delirium, he began talking, words tumbling out between gasps. Should've protected her better. My little girl. Sold like cattle. Forgive me. Margaret. Failed our daughter. Shh, Papa. Save your strength. But the fever had loosened his tongue, and secrets spilled like water through a broken dam. Clay Morgan, good man, saved Thompson's whole family, then ran to save his own. Too late. Always too late. Town blamed him. Cowards. Sarah continued her ministrations, but her father's revelations painted a different picture than she'd known. Clay hadn't simply been absent when his family died, he'd been saving others, running from house to house as the fever spread, only to find his own family gone when he finally returned home. Told him. Not his fault. Her father wheezed. Man can't be. Everywhere. But guilt ate him. Saw him at the graves, planning to join them. Talked him down. Told him to live. Make it mean something. Thunder crashed overhead, and Sarah wondered if Clay was even still alive out there. The creek would be a torrent by now. The trail washed out. Even if he reached Dr. Mitchell, returning would be nearly impossible. Her father's breathing grew more labored despite her efforts. She was losing him, watching him drown in his own lungs while rain pounded the roof like fists. She pounded harder on his back, tears streaming down her face. Please, Papa, hold on. Clay will bring help. Clay. Her father's voice was barely a whisper. Tell him. Debt paid. Tell him. His words dissolved into coughing, and Sarah resumed her desperate rhythm. The lamp oil ran low, casting dancing shadows as the storm raged. She added more oil with one hand while supporting her father with the other, muscles screaming in protest. 5 o'clock brought a brief lull in the storm, but no sign of Clay. Sarah's mind conjured images of him swept away in the creek, his horse fallen with a broken leg, his body lying broken somewhere in the darkness. She pushed the thoughts away, focusing on her father's breathing. Then, through the rain's lessening patter, she heard horses, multiple horses. The door burst open, and Clay staggered in, soaked through and bleeding from a gash on his forehead. Behind him, Dr. Mitchell appeared, medical bag in hand, followed impossibly by Mrs. Chen and 2 other women from town. How? Sarah gasped. Met them on the road, Clay said, collapsing into a chair. Coming to help. Mrs. Chen had a feeling. Dr. Mitchell was already examining Judge Harper, pulling instruments from his bag. Clay's right acute pulmonary edema. Sarah, keep doing exactly what you're doing. Mrs. Chen, I need hot water. All you can boil. Clay, can you stand? Clay nodded, though Sarah could see the effort it cost him. Help me prepare the mustard plasters. We need them stronger than usual. They worked through the dawn, Dr. Mitchell directing their efforts with practiced efficiency. The mustard plasters went on Judge Harper's chest and back, their sharp smell filling the room. Dr. Mitchell produced a tincture Sarah didn't recognize, dosing her father carefully while Clay held him steady. Digitalis, the doctor explained, helps the heart pump stronger, moves fluid from the lungs. Slowly, agonizingly, Judge Harper's breathing eased. The blue tinge faded from his lips, and his eyes focused with growing clarity. By full daylight, he was breathing on his own, weak but stable. Dr. Mitchell packed his bag with obvious exhaustion. He's through the worst. Keep the treatments going, Clay knows what to do. I've left enough digitalis for a week. Your fee, Sarah began, but the doctor waved her off. Clay already paid. Gave me his horse, finest animal I've seen, worth triple my usual rate. He glanced at Clay, who was slumped in the chair, eyes closed. That man rode through hell tonight. When we met on the trail, his horse was near dead from the pace. He traded it for my fresh mount, then walked the last 2 miles carrying my medical supplies so I could ride ahead. Sarah looked at Clay, seeing fully for the first time the extent of his injuries. Beyond the head gash, his hands were torn raw from controlling the reins, and she could see blood seeping through his shirt where branches had torn flesh. He needs tending, Mrs. Chen said firmly. You see to your father. We'll handle Mr. Morgan. But when the women tried to help him, Clay waved them off, struggling to his feet. I'm fine. Need to check the stock. Storm might have spooked them. He made it 2 steps before his legs gave out. Sarah caught him as he fell, his weight nearly taking them both down. For a moment, they were pressed together, and she felt him burning with fever against her. You're sick, she said, fear spiking fresh. The ride, the cold rain. Just tired, he mumbled, but his eyes were glassy, unfocused. Doctor. Mitchell returned from the doorway, medical bag reopening. Pneumonia, most likely. Starting stages. Mrs. Chen, we'll need more hot water. Sarah, help me get him to bed. The stable, Clay protested weakly. You're going to a proper bed if I have to carry you myself, Sarah said fiercely. You nearly died saving my father. You'll recover in this house, not in hay like livestock. They managed to get him to the small room adjacent to Sarah's, the one she'd prepared days ago expecting him to claim it. Now she and Mrs. Chen stripped his soaked clothes while he drifted in and out of consciousness, revealing the full extent of his injuries. Old scars crisscrossed newer wounds, telling stories of 5 years' hard labor and tonight's desperate ride. As Dr. Mitchell worked, Clay's fever climbed. He began talking, words spilling out like her father's had, but where Judge Harper had revealed guilt, Clay revealed grief. Should have been there. Emma calling for me. Mary alone. Failed them. Always too late. Everyone else lived. Why not them? My fault. My fault. Sarah found herself holding his hand as Dr. Mitchell applied poultices to his chest. Clay's fingers gripped hers with surprising strength. Sarah. His eyes focused briefly. Your father. Alive because of you. Resting. Good. His eyes drifted closed. Debt paid. Both sides now. She stayed with him through the morning as his fever raged. Mrs. Chen and the other women took turns helping, bringing broth and fresh water, changing sweat-soaked sheets. The storm had passed, leaving crystal-clear skies. But inside the boarding house, another kind of storm played out in Clay's delirium. He called for his dead wife and daughter, apologizing endlessly. He relived the night of their deaths, trying to rewrite history in his fever dreams. Sometimes he called for Sarah, not the real woman holding his hand, but the idealized version who'd comforted his dying family. You sang to them, he said during one lucid moment. Hymns. Shall we gather at the river? Emma loved that one. I remember, Sarah said softly. She wasn't afraid at the end. You made sure. Tears leaked from his closed eyes. How do I thank someone for that? You already have, Sarah said, thinking of the land deeds, the auction, this terrible ride through storm and flood. By afternoon, Clay's fever broke. He slept naturally then, breathing easier. The crisis passed. Sarah finally left his side to check on her father, finding him awake and coherent. Clay was his first word. Recovering. He'll be fine. Her father's eyes filled with tears. I heard him ride out. In that storm. For me. He saved your life. And I once saved his, though he doesn't see it that way. Judge Harper took her hand weakly. That man carries guilt like stones. Daughter. Each one precisely weighed and counted. He saved 7 families during the fever. 7 complete families lived because Clay Morgan ran himself ragged helping them. But he only counts the 2 he lost. Sarah thought of Clay's fevered confessions, his endless apologies to ghosts. How do you help someone carrying that much pain? Her father squeezed her hand. You can't lift the stones for him, but maybe you can help him set them down, one at a time. That evening, Sarah sat between 2 sick rooms, keeping watch over both men who'd nearly died in the storm, one from drowning in his own lungs, the other from riding through hell to prevent it. The boarding house had become an infirmary, but somehow that felt right. This was what the place had always been, really a way station for the broken, a place to heal before moving on. Clay woke near sunset, clear-eyed and embarrassed to find himself in a proper bed. I need to rest, Sarah said firmly. The stock are fine. Mrs. Chen's husband saw to them. You're staying in that bed until Dr. Mitchell clears you. Whiskey. He studied her face, something shifting in his expression. You stayed with me. You rode through a killing storm for my father. The least I could do was hold your hand through a fever. I said things, in the fever, nothing that matters. But they both knew that wasn't true. The fever had revealed truths they'd both been carrying: guilt, grief, the terrible weight of survival. Clay had saved others, but couldn't forgive himself for not saving everyone. Sarah had maintained dignity through degradation, but couldn't forget being sold like property. Your father, Clay asked, sleeping peacefully. He wants to thank you. No need. Debts are settled. Sarah thought of her father's words about stones and setting them down. Maybe it's not about debt anymore. Maybe it's just about choosing to help each other. Clay was quiet for a long moment, watching sunset paint the walls gold. I'm not good at accepting help. Neither am I. But we're both alive because other people didn't give us a choice in the matter. She stood, smoothing her skirts. Mrs. Chen left soup. You'll eat it. Then sleep. Tomorrow we'll deal with taxes and land contracts. Tonight, we rest. As she ladled soup into a bowl, Sarah realized something had fundamentally changed. The crisis had stripped away pretense, revealing the core of who they were: 2 damaged people trying to rebuild from ruins, carrying guilt and grief but also extraordinary capacity for sacrifice. Clay had literally bled to save her father. She'd fought death itself to keep them both alive until help came. They were no longer seller and sold, or even reluctant partners. They were something else, something forged in storm and sickness, in desperate rides and fevered vigils. Not love, not yet, but recognition of shared pain, of mutual strength, of the possibility that 2 broken people might build something whole. The entire town seemed to have gathered in the boarding house's small parlor, spilling out onto the porch and into the street. Word had spread about Clay's desperate ride through the storm, about Judge Harper's near death and miraculous recovery. And now Copper Creek citizens came bearing food, apologies, and curiosity in equal measure. Sarah stood in her mother's navy dress, the same one from the auction, but this time she'd added her grandmother's pearl brooch at the collar. Clay sat beside her father's chair, still pale from his own bout with pneumonia, but insisting he was well enough for company. Judge Harper, propped up with pillows, looked frailer than before, but his eyes held new life. We should have done this proper the first time, Mrs. Patterson said, arranging dishes on the makeshift tables. A wedding reception, even late, deserves celebration. Sarah caught Clay's slight grimace. Neither had asked for this gathering, but the town's guilt had manifested as aggressive hospitality. Women who'd wept at the auction now brought their finest dishes. Men who'd laughed at Clay's foolishness now clapped him on the shoulder, calling him hero. Mayor Aldrich stood, raising his glass of punch. To Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, may their union, born of unusual circumstances, prove that good can come from hardship. The crowd murmured agreement, though Sarah noticed Morton standing in the corner, his pale eyes calculating. He'd been too quiet since the storm, and Sarah had learned that a quiet Morton was a dangerous Morton. "Speech," someone called out. "Let's hear from the groom." Clay stood reluctantly, his discomfort obvious. "I'm not one for speeches, just grateful for your kindness and for Dr. Mitchell's skill. That's all." But the crowd wanted more, needed more to assuage their collective conscience. They pressed forward, and Sarah saw Clay's jaw tighten, his hand moving unconsciously to his side where storm wounds still healing. "I have something for my wife," Clay said suddenly, perhaps to end the attention. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a wooden box, worn smooth with age and handling. The crowd leaned in, expecting jewelry or some valuable gift. Sarah recognized the box she'd seen it in Clay's saddlebags, carefully wrapped in oilcloth. He'd carried it through 5 years of railroad camps. "This was my father's," Clay said, handing it to her. "He made it from oak on our old homestead in Missouri. It's not much, but it's what I have to give." Someone snickered Thornton's nephew, Sarah thought. A wooden box. That's the wedding gift. Others joined the laughter. Though it was uncomfortable, uncertain, Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, not for herself but for Clay, who stood there taking their mockery with dignity. She opened the box. The laughter stopped. Inside, carefully organized and tied with ribbon, were 23 land deeds, each one properly notarized, each one for parcels surrounding the original Harper Ranch. But it was the paper on top that stole her breath, a legal document from Hayes and Associates in Denver. "Read it aloud," Judge Harper said softly, having glimpsed the contents. Sarah's voice shook as she read, "Transfer of property rights, executed this day. All lands listed herein to be held solely in the name of Sarah Frances Harper Morgan, exempt from coverture laws, exempt from spousal claim." She looked up at Clay, unable to continue. He took the document gently, reading the rest in his steady voice. "Furthermore, this document serves as preliminary filing for marriage annulment, requiring only the wife's signature to execute. Upon signing, all properties remain with Sarah Frances Harper Morgan, and the marriage contracted on shall be dissolved without prejudice or further obligation." The silence was complete. Even the children outside had stopped playing. Sarah's hands trembled as she lifted the next document, a letter in Clay's careful handwriting. "Sarah, these lands were always meant to be yours. Your father saved my life with his words when I had no reason to continue. You saved my soul with your kindness to my family when they needed it most. This is not payment or purchase. This is return of what was wrongfully taken. You are free to sign the annulment. You are free to go, to stay, to choose whatever path you wish. The land is yours regardless. I require nothing in return. You owe me nothing. You never did. Clay." The wooden box shook in her hands as she understood the full magnitude of what he'd done. 5 years of backbreaking labor, of sleeping in dirt and snow, of denying himself everything not to buy a wife, but to restore her inheritance and give her the freedom to leave him. 2,000 acres, someone whispered. "That's worth more than money." Judge Harper interrupted, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "That's worth a man's soul, given freely." Sarah looked around the room at the stunned faces. Thornton had gone red, realizing Clay had never intended to keep her bound. Morton's calculated expression had turned to shock. The women were crying openly now, but these were different tears than at the auction. "You bought me to free me," Sarah said to Clay, her voice carrying in the silence. "I bought you to keep Thornton from having you." Clay corrected quietly. "The freedom was always yours. I just formalized it." Mayor Aldrich cleared his throat roughly. "In 30 years of law practice, I've never... This is unprecedented." "Unprecedented?" Sarah stood, still holding the box. "This man spent 5 years gathering stones, that's what the railroad crews call it. Gathering stones for the rail beds, backbreaking work that kills most men before 40. He gathered stones in Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, sleeping in tents in winter, in dust storms in summer, eating beans and hardtack, sending every penny here to buy back land that Morton stole through legal trickery. She turned to Morton. You thought you were so clever, raising interest rates when my father fell ill. Calling in loans early. You took our ranch piece by piece, legally but immorally. And this man, this raggedy cowboy you mocked, spent 5 years undoing your damage. Now see here. Morton started. Quiet. The command came from Judge Harper. Despite his weakness, his voice carried the authority of decades on the bench. I may be dying, but I'm not dead yet. And I have something to say. He struggled to sit straighter, Clay immediately moving to help him. This town watched my daughter sold at auction. Some protested. Yes, but not enough. You let it happen because it was legal, because Morton had papers and precedents. You laughed when Clay Morgan spent his last dollar to save her from Thornton, called him a fool. The judge's eyes swept the room. But this fool spent 5 years planning not to own my daughter, but to free her. He bought the land Morton stole. He nearly died bringing Dr. Mitchell through that storm to save me. And now he offers my daughter complete freedom, financial and legal, asking nothing in return. Judge Harper looked directly at Morton. You're the fool, sir. You thought everything had a price. Clay Morgan just proved that some things, honor, dignity, freedom, are beyond your ability to purchase or steal. The room erupted in voices, but Sarah heard none of it. She was looking at Clay, who stood quietly beside her father, uncomfortable with the attention but not backing down. His brown eyes met hers, and she saw no expectation there, no demand. Just that same quiet strength that had carried him through 5 years of exile and labor. Mr. Morgan, she said formally, causing the room to quiet. I need to respond to your gift. Clay nodded, bracing himself. Several people later swore they saw him close his eyes, preparing for rejection. Sarah took the annulment papers from the box. The room held its breath as she studied them, reading through the legal language that would dissolve their marriage with her single signature. Morton stepped forward, perhaps hoping to witness the humiliation of Clay's rejection. With deliberate movements, Sarah tore the annulment papers in half, then in quarters, then eighths. The pieces fluttered to the floor like snow. I choose to stay, she said clearly, her voice carrying to the street where more townspeople had gathered. Not because I was bought, not because I have no options, but because a man who would spend 5 years laboring to free me deserves more than abandonment. She turned to Clay, whose eyes had opened in shock. You gave me a choice. This is what I choose. Partnership, not possession. Building something together on the land you bled to restore. Clay's voice was rough. Sarah, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. That's why I can. She took his scarred hands in hers, feeling the calluses from 5 years of gathering stones. You saved me from the auction block. You saved my father's life. You restored my family's land. Let me be clear. Clayton Morgan, I choose you. Not from obligation or gratitude, but because I want to see what we can build together. The room exploded in celebration. Women sobbed into handkerchiefs while men cheered. Even hardened cowboys wiped their eyes. Morton slipped out quietly, his schemes in ruins. Thornton followed, muttering about fools and their money. Mrs. Chen started the applause, and it spread through the house and into the street, but Sarah barely heard it. She was watching Clay's face transform from shock to something like wonder, then to a joy so profound it took her breath away. Are you sure? He whispered, for her ears only. I've never been more sure of anything, she replied. But Clay, I need to know, do you want this too? Not from obligation to my father or guilt about your family, but for yourself. Clay was quiet for a moment, and Sarah saw him wrestling with something deep and painful. Then, With what seemed like physical effort, she watched him set down one of those invisible stones her father had mentioned. "Yes," he said simply. "I want this. I want you. Not as property or obligation, but as my partner. My wife. If you'll have me truly." Sarah smiled, feeling tears on her cheeks. "Then let's make it official. Properly this time." Father Miguel, who'd been standing near the back, came forward with his prayer book. "I believe we have unfinished business from that chapel ceremony. Shall we complete it properly?" This time, when they spoke their vows, the words carried different weight, not contracts and obligations, but promises freely given. When Father Miguel said Clay could kiss his bride, Clay hesitated, still uncertain of boundaries. Sarah solved the problem by kissing him first, a gentle press of lips that sent the crowd into fresh celebration. It wasn't passionate or dramatic, it was better. It was a promise, a seal on choices freely made. As the celebration continued around them, Sarah kept hold of the wooden box with its precious contents. 23 deeds to land that represented not ownership, but freedom. Inside, she'd noticed something else, a daguerreotype of Clay's family, wrapped carefully in cloth, Mary and Emma Morgan, smiling in their Sunday best, preserved in silver and light. "We'll put this in the main house," she told Clay quietly. "They should be remembered where we build our future." Clay's eyes filled, and Sarah watched another stone fall away from his shoulders. The party continued late into the evening, the town finally able to celebrate properly what had begun in shame. Judge Harper tired quickly and was helped to bed, but not before gripping Clay's hand with surprising strength. "Take care of her," he whispered. "She takes care of herself." Clay replied, "I'm just honored to stand beside her." The judge smiled. "That's the right answer, son." As the last guests finally departed, Sarah and Clay stood on the porch, looking out at the stars over the land that was now theirs to share. The wooden box sat on the table inside, its contents representing not just property but possibility. 2,000 acres, Sarah mused. "That's a lot of responsibility." "We'll manage," Clay said. "Together." She leaned against him slightly, feeling him tense, then slowly relax. They had a long way to go, these two damaged souls. Trust would take time. Love might take longer. But they had chosen each other freely, without coercion or obligation. And that made all the difference. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the choice." "Thank you," he replied, "for choosing to stay." Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, and somewhere in the distance, a harmonica played not mournfully this time, but with something that sounded like hope. The auction that had begun in degradation had transformed into something neither could have imagined, a true partnership, born from sacrifice and sustained by free will. The wooden box, simple and worn, had contained more than deeds. It had held freedom, choice, and the radical notion that love couldn't be bought or sold, only freely given. And in giving Sarah her freedom, Clay had somehow found his own. The morning sun cast long shadows across the restored Harper Ranch as Sarah stood on the porch, watching the horizon where prairie met sky. A year had passed since the auction, since Clay's desperate ride through the storm, since she'd torn up the annulment papers in front of the entire town. The woman who stood here now bore little resemblance to the desperate daughter who'd been sold to settle debts. Inside, she heard Clay moving about the kitchen, preparing breakfast as had become his habit. They'd developed rhythms in their shared life, unspoken agreements about space and time, work and rest. He still rose before dawn, but now he made coffee for two. She still counted pennies, but now they counted together, planning and building. "Sarah," Clay called, "your father's asking for you." Judge Harper had survived longer than Dr. Mitchell predicted, as if will alone kept him breathing. They'd moved him to the ranch house 6 months ago, setting up his room with a view of the mountains he'd loved. Each day was borrowed time, but it was time spent in dignity, not desperation. Sarah found her father propped up in bed, his face thin but peaceful. The morning light made his white hair glow like a halo. "Daughter," he said, patting the bed beside him. "Sit with me." She sat, taking his frail hand in hers. Through the window, they could see Clay heading to the barn, his movements sure and purposeful. The ranch had prospered under their joint management, the Army contracts Sarah had negotiated, the innovative hay cultivation Clay had implemented. They'd paid the taxes with room to spare. "He's a good man," her father said, following her gaze. "Yes. But more than that, you're good together, equal partners." He squeezed her hand weakly. "Your mother would be proud. You took a situation meant to diminish you and transformed it into something remarkable." Sarah thought of the past year, the slow building of trust, the careful negotiation of intimacy, the gradual transformation from arrangement to genuine partnership. She and Clay had moved from separate bedrooms to shared space, not through passion but through choice, each step deliberate and mutual. "I have something for you," her father said, reaching for the bedside table with trembling fingers. He pulled out an envelope, worn at the edges. "From Clay. He asked me to give this to you today." Sarah opened it, finding a single sheet in Clay's careful handwriting. "Sarah, 1 year ago, I made you a promise of freedom. Today, I make you a promise of partnership. If you're willing, I'd like to renew our vows not as buyer and bought, not as debtor and creditor, but as husband and wife who choose each other freely. The chapel has been repaired. Father Miguel is waiting, but only if you choose it. Always and only your choice. Clay." Sarah looked up to find her father smiling. "He asked my blessing last week. I told him he didn't need it, you make your own choices. But I also told him I couldn't imagine a better partner for my daughter." Through the window, Sarah saw townspeople arriving. Mrs. Chen carried a basket of flowers. Dr. Mitchell drove his buggy with his wife beside him. Even some of the ranch hands had cleaned up, their best clothes still bearing the dust of honest work. "Did everyone know except me?" "Clay wanted to surprise you. He said you'd given him a gift last year, the gift of choosing to stay. He wanted to give you something in return, the chance to choose again, with full knowledge of who you both are now." Sarah stood, her decision already made, not from obligation or gratitude, but from a year of watching Clay work beside her, of seeing him slowly forgive himself for his family's death, of building something beautiful from the ashes of loss. She found Clay in the barn, brushing down the new mare they'd bought with the profit from their first successful harvest. He looked up at her entrance, vulnerability clear in his brown eyes. "I found your letter," she said. He set down the brush, wiping his hands on his pants. "You don't have to answer now, or ever. I just wanted—" Sarah crossed the distance between them, taking his face in her hands. "Clayton Morgan, are you asking me to marry you properly this time?" "I'm asking you to choose," he said softly. "Every day, I want you to choose, not because you have to, but because you want to." "Then my answer is yes. Yesterday, today, tomorrow, yes." They walked to the chapel together, her hand in his. The building had been restored over the past months, the community coming together to repair what time and weather had damaged. New glass filled the windows, casting rainbow light across the floor. The pews were full of neighbors, friends, people who'd witnessed their journey from auction block to genuine partnership. Sarah wore a simple dress she'd made herself from fabric bought with their first profits. Clay wore his father's suit, altered to fit his rail-hardened frame. They stood before the altar where they'd spoken desperate vows a year ago, but everything was different now. Father Miguel's eyes twinkled as he opened his prayer book. "Dearly beloved, we gather today not to create a union, but to celebrate one that has been forged through trial and triumph, through choice and commitment." This time, their vows were their own. Clay went first, his voice steady. "Sarah, you gave me purpose when I had none. You showed me that guilt isn't honor, that punishment isn't penance. You took my broken pieces and helped me build something whole. I promise to choose you every morning, to work beside you, to respect your strength and support you in moments of weakness. I promise to be not your owner but your partner, not your master but your friend, not your burden but your blessing." Sarah's voice was clear and strong. "Clay, you bought my freedom with your sacrifice, then gave it back without condition. You showed me that love isn't possession, that marriage isn't ownership. You took my shame and transformed it into strength. I promise to choose you freely, to build with you deliberately, to stand beside you in drought and abundance. I promise to be not your property but your partner, not your obligation but your joy, not your debt but your chosen love." When Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife properly this time, the chapel erupted in celebration. But the moment that mattered most came in the quiet after. As Sarah and Clay stood together looking out at their land. "No more guilt," Sarah said firmly. "No more stones to carry." Clay nodded, and she saw peace in his eyes for the first time. "No more debts either. We're free. Both of us." They returned to the ranch house to find tables set up in the yard, the community having organized a proper wedding feast. Judge Harper sat in his wheeled chair on the porch, weak but radiant with joy. Morton was notably absent, having left town months ago when his schemes finally caught up with him. Thornton had sold his ranch and moved to California, unable to bear the daily reminder of his humiliation. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Sarah found herself in the room she'd established as a schoolhouse. 20 children now came 3 days a week to learn, their families paying in eggs, vegetables, and labor. The walls were covered with slate boards and maps. McGuffey readers lined the shelves. Clay appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "The party's winding down." She accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how he'd prepared it exactly as she liked, a luxury they could afford now, though they both remembered when they couldn't. "I've been thinking," she said, running her hand over the smooth wood of a desk Clay had built. "This room could be expanded, maybe add another teacher. There are so many children in the valley who need education." "We have the funds," Clay agreed. "That last cattle drive paid well for grazing rights." Sarah turned to face him fully. "Clay, there's something else. Something I need to tell you." His expression grew concerned. "What is it?" She took his hand, placing it on her still flat stomach. "I'm carrying our child. Dr. Mitchell confirmed it yesterday." Clay's face transformed through a series of emotions: shock, fear, wonder, and finally, pure joy. "A child," he whispered. "Our child. Are you happy?" Instead of answering with words, Clay pulled her into his arms, holding her with infinite gentleness. She felt him tremble slightly and realized he was crying not from grief this time, but from happiness. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said against her hair. "A family. A future." "You deserve it," Sarah said firmly. "We both do." They stood together in the schoolroom as evening deepened outside. Through the window, Sarah could see their guests departing, calling out final congratulations. Her father had been taken inside to rest, but she'd seen his face when she'd whispered her news to him earlier, pure contentment, knowing his grandchild would be born free, would grow up on the land he'd thought lost forever. 6 months later. Sarah stood in the same spot, her belly now round with promise, teaching a class of 25 children. Clay had indeed expanded the room, adding windows and a second entrance. He'd also built a cradle that sat in the corner, ready for their child who would grow up surrounded by books and learning. Judge Harper had lived to hold his grandchild, a daughter they named Emma Grace, honoring both the past and the future. He'd passed peacefully 3 days later, his last words a blessing on the family that had risen from the ashes of auction and despair. The ranch prospered beyond their dreams. They'd hired 2 families to help work the land, paying fair wages and building proper houses for them. The Army contracts continued, supplemented by innovative farming techniques Clay had learned from Chinese railroad workers. Sarah's school had become a source of pride for the valley, producing students who could read, write, and figure better than many townsfolk. But the greatest success wasn't measured in dollars or acres. It was in the quiet evenings when Clay played harmonica while Sarah read aloud. It was in the mornings when they worked side by side, planning and building. It was in the way they'd learned to carry each other's griefs without being crushed by them. "Mama! Papa!" young Emma called from outside, where Clay was teaching her to ride the gentle pony they'd bought for her 4th birthday. "Look what I can do." Sarah moved to the doorway, her hand resting on her stomach where their second child grew. She watched her daughter ride in careful circles while Clay walked alongside, ready to catch her if she fell, but giving her room to find her own balance. This was what freedom looked like, not the absence of connection, but the choice to connect. Not the absence of responsibility, but the joy of shared purpose. Clay had bought her at auction to free her, and in freeing her, had freed himself. The wooden box that had held the deeds now sat on their mantel, filled with new treasures, Emma's first drawings, pressed flowers from their renewal ceremony, photographs of the family they'd built. It remained simple and worn, made precious not by its contents but by what it represented, the transformation of a desperate transaction into chosen love. As the sun set over Harper Ranch, rechristened Morgan Ranch by the community but always called simply home by its inhabitants, Sarah knew that some stories don't end with happily ever after. They end with happily ever choosing the daily decision to build something beautiful from whatever materials life provides. The auction block had been burned for firewood the winter after their wedding, its wood warming the church during a particularly harsh freeze. From its ashes had grown not just survival, but abundance. Not just freedom, but love. Not just a business arrangement, but a family that would endure for generations. In the end, the poorest cowboy in Copper Creek had indeed possessed the richest heart, and in giving everything to free one woman, had gained more than gold could ever purchase: a true partner, a real family, and the knowledge that love, freely chosen, is the only wealth that matters. You know, friend. I've told you this story about Sarah and Clay because sometimes we forget the simplest truths. We get so caught up in what we think we own: land, money, even people, that we miss what really matters. Clay Morgan spent everything he had, not to possess Sarah, but to give her the freedom to choose. And in that giving, he discovered something precious. Gratitude isn't about owing or being owed. It's about recognizing the gifts we've already received. Sarah's father saved Clay with words when grief nearly destroyed him. Sarah saved Clay's soul by singing to his dying daughter. These weren't debts to be repaid, but gifts that created more gifts, rippling outward like stones in still water. When Clay bought Sarah's freedom, when Sarah chose to stay, when they built their family on that recovered land, each act was both gratitude and gift combined. That's what family really is, isn't it? Not bonds of obligation, but chosen connections. Not people we own, but people we choose to stand beside, day after day. The auction that began in shame became a testament to the truth that love cannot be bought or sold, only freely given and gratefully received. Sometimes the poorest among us have the richest hearts. Sometimes freedom means choosing to stay. Sometimes the greatest gift is simply the chance to choose.